The water hit me like a wall. Cold, black, disorienting in a way I never expected from the Gulf of Mexico in late October. 1 second, I was standing at the stern railing with a glass of champagne in my hand, looking out at the lights of Clearwater Beach in the distance, and the next second I was underwater, swallowing salt, fighting my own body's instinct to breathe. I'm 63 years old. I built a lumber distribution company from a single flatbed truck and a handshake deal with a sawmill owner in Georgia. I survived a divorce, a recession, a market that tried to kill me twice. But nothing prepared me for the feeling of hands on my back. Deliberate, 2 palms, flat, and then a shove. Not an accident. Not a stumble. A decision someone had made before they even walked up behind me. I surfaced, gasping. The yacht was maybe 40 feet away already, drifting or moving. I couldn't tell which. The music was still playing. Someone had connected their phone to the speaker system before dinner and put on that kind of easy jazz that's supposed to say, "We've arrived." It floated across the water to me while I tread and coughed and tried to understand what had just happened to my life. I looked up at my own boat. The deck lights were on. I could see silhouettes moving around up there. Laughing, probably. Refilling glasses. My glass was still floating near me, bobbing upside down. a $140 bottle of Paul Roger, and the whole thing was now somewhere below me in the Gulf. That's when I made the decision. Right there, with salt in my eyes, and my dress shoes filling with water, and my heart hammering in a way my cardiologist would not have approved of. I decided I wasn't going to climb back on that boat and pretend it was an accident. I wasn't going to give whoever did this a chance to try again. I was going to let them think they'd succeeded. I turned away from my own yacht and started swimming toward the marina lights. I should back up, give you the context, because none of this makes sense without it. In August of that year, I sold Kellerman Lumber Distribution. The whole company. The warehouse facilities in Tampa and Savannah and Baton Rouge, the fleet, the client contracts, the name. 51 years old when I started it, 63 when I let it go, 12 years of every weekend, and most of my evenings, and probably more stress than any human being should willingly absorb. The final number, after closing costs and the tax hit, landed at $38 million in my personal accounts. $38 million. I kept saying it to myself in the week after closing, not because I was showing off. I had nobody to show off to, but because it didn't feel real. I'd grown up in a 3-bedroom house in Pensacola with a father who drove a propane delivery truck. We ate tuna casserole on Fridays because ground beef was a luxury. $38 million was not a number that existed in the universe I came from. My daughter was the first person I called. She's 31. Her name is Brianna, and I have loved her since the moment the nurse put her in my arms in 1993, which is a feeling I suspect you either understand or you don't. Her mother and I split when Brianna was 9. It wasn't pretty, but we were decent about it. Decent enough that Brianna grew up functional and kind and sharp in a way that still surprises me sometimes. She screamed when I told her. Literally screamed. Happy. She was happy for me, and it was genuine, and I could hear it, and I sat in my empty office. I'd already turned in the keys to the new owners, and I cried a little, quietly, with my hand over the phone so she couldn't hear. Then she said, "Hold on, let me get Dex." That's her husband. Dexter Albright. They met at a golf resort outside Phoenix, where she was working in hospitality management and he was attending a conference for real estate developers. He's 40, which always struck me as a larger age gap than I'd have liked for my daughter. But Brianna was never interested in my opinions about her personal life. Fair enough. She's an adult. I didn't dislike Dexter when I met him. That's important to say. He's good-looking, well-dressed, articulate in that way that people who sell things for a living tend to be. He remembered details about previous conversations. He laughed at the right moments. He asked about my company with what seemed like genuine curiosity. The first year Brianna brought him around, I thought, okay, fine. She could have done worse. The second year, things started to feel slightly off-register. Nothing I could put my finger on cleanly. It was more like a photograph that's slightly out of focus. You can see the image, but the edges are blurry in a way that bothers you without your being able to name exactly why. He started asking different questions, specific ones, about the structure of my company, about whether I had a will, and whether it had been updated recently, about what I planned to do with the business when I retired. Small questions, the kind you can brush off individually without seeming paranoid, but the kind that pile up over time into a pattern. I told Brianna once, gently, that I thought Dexter was unusually interested in my finances. She looked at me the way people look at someone who said something slightly embarrassing at a dinner party. Dad, he's just curious. He's in real estate. He's interested in business. Don't make it weird. I didn't push it. When the sale closed, I decided to do something I'd never done in my adult life. I decided to celebrate properly. I rented a 60-foot motor yacht for a weekend out of the Clearwater marina. I invited 8 people, my accountant and his wife, my attorney, the one who'd handled the sale, 2 old friends from Pensacola I'd known since high school, and Brianna and Dexter. Brianna was excited. She called me 3 times in the week before to talk about what to pack, what the food situation would be like, whether she should bring a bottle of something as a gift. That's Brianna. She's a planner. She got that from me. Dexter, when I spoke to him directly to confirm the details, was asking about the marina. Specifically, he wanted to know if I'd arranged for any crew beyond the captain. How many people would be on board total? What the schedule looked like. I assumed he was the kind of person who likes to know the logistics. I'd met plenty of people like that. What I didn't know, at the time, was that he'd been asking around about me in a different way than I realized. The night of the party, everything started beautifully. My attorney, a man I've known for 19 years named Vance, just Vance, he's always gone by his last name, poured everyone champagne on the rear deck while the sun was still up and gave a toast that made 2 of us tear up a little. My friend from Pensacola, Doug Whitaker, who I've known since we were both 15 and stupid, stood up afterward and told a story about me from 1989 that I will not repeat here because it's not flattering, and everyone laughed, including me. Dinner was good. The boat was moving slowly, the way you move when you're not really going anywhere in particular, just out far enough that the shore looks like a string of lights. I was genuinely happy. That's the part that still lands on me when I let myself think about it. I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy for the first time in a long time. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, I noticed Dexter watching me, not in an obvious way. He was always talking to someone else when I glanced over, always mid-sentence, smiling that particular smile of his. But there's something you develop over 63 years, a sensitivity to being watched, and it was going off like a low alarm I couldn't quite locate. I got up to use the head below deck. When I came back up, I went to the stern instead of rejoining the main group. The night air was cooler out there. I stood at the railing with what I thought was my champagne glass. I'd left it on the rail before going down, and I looked out at the water. I took 1 sip. Maybe 2. My head felt strange almost immediately. Not dizzy, exactly. More like the space between my thoughts had become slightly longer than usual, like the connections were slowing down. I set the glass down on the rail and gripped the railing itself, thinking I'd had more to drink than I'd realized. That's when I felt the hands. I swam for a long time, longer than I would have guessed I had in me, honestly. The water was warm enough that hypothermia wasn't an immediate concern, and the lights of the marina were a fixed point I could orient myself toward. I'm not a strong swimmer, but I'm adequate, and 63 years of working physically demanding jobs will maintain a baseline of fitness that's easy to underestimate. I was maybe 200 yards from the marina dock when I heard the boat behind me. A smaller one, tender, probably, the kind that comes with bigger charters. I turned in the water and the searchlight found me, and a voice said loudly and with professional calm, "Sir, stop moving. I'm coming to you." The captain's name was Fowler. He was maybe 45, broad across the shoulders, with the permanently weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his adult life on the water. He pulled me over the side of the tender like I weighed nothing and wrapped a thermal blanket around me before I'd gotten my second breath. I said, "How did you find me?" He said, "I saw him push you." He'd been watching from the wheelhouse. He'd had his eye on Dexter for the last hour of the trip, because Dexter had come up to the bridge twice. Once asking about the route, once about what depth we were over, and Fowler said in all his years of charters, guests ask about speed and destination. Nobody asks about depth unless they have a reason to. He'd also seen Dexter swap my champagne glass while I was below deck. I wasn't sure what he put in it, Fowler said. But he switched them, took yours, and put a different one in the same spot. I sat in the tender with the blanket around me and thought for a moment. Does anyone on the boat know you came after me? No, he said. I left the mate in charge. Told him I saw something in the water, which I did. And don't go back yet, I said. Give me a minute to think. Fowler looked at me with the expression of a man who was recalibrating. He'd expected to rescue a drowning accident victim. He was now in the middle of something more complicated. They're going to find out quickly that you're not in the water anymore, he said, or they're going to assume you went under. Let them assume, I said. My attorney Vance picked me up at the marina in 45 minutes. He's not an excitable man. In 19 years, I've seen him rattle exactly twice, and one of those times involved a courthouse filing system that had eaten 3 years of case records. So were the bars high. When he saw me dripping on the dock, he said, I'll call no one, and handed me his jacket. We sat in his car for 2 hours while I told him everything. Fowler had agreed to come with me, and he sat in the back seat and filled in the parts he'd seen that I hadn't. What Vance told me next, quietly, watching the windshield, is what rearranged my understanding of the past 6 months. 3 weeks before the sale of my company closed, someone had contacted the acquiring firm's legal team, inquiring about the status of the transaction. Claiming to be acting on my behalf, the acquiring firm had flagged it as unusual and mentioned it to Vance in passing, who'd assumed it was a miscommunication and not followed up. He'd been meaning to mention it to me, he said. He hadn't. The name used in the inquiry was Dexter Albright. I looked out the windshield at the marina parking lot for a while. What does he think he's going to do? I said. The money is already in my accounts. Vance was quiet for a moment. If he can establish power of attorney over your affairs, if he can produce documentation suggesting you're incapacitated or deceased, I have no will that gives him anything. He'd need to work through Brianna. I didn't say anything to that. Neither did Vance. What we decided, sitting in that car, was that I was going to stay dead. For now. Vance would keep the accounts frozen in a way that required his direct sign-off to access. Fowler signed a statement that night documenting what he'd seen, and I went to stay at a cabin my friend Doug Whitaker owned near Ocala, which nobody connected to Dexter or Brianna knew about. I want to be honest about what the next 2 weeks felt like, because I think people imagine that this kind of situation is all adrenaline and strategy and forward momentum. It isn't. It's mostly sitting in a borrowed cabin watching the ceiling at 2 a.m, trying to understand how you ended up here. I thought about Brianna constantly. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know how involved she was. I couldn't let myself assume. She'd been warm and genuine on that boat. I replayed every moment I could remember. Before the champagne, before the railing. And I knew my daughter well enough to know the difference between her performed happiness and her real happiness. The call when I told her about the sale. That was real, but I also knew she'd been with this man for 4 years, that she built a life around him, that people can love someone and still be shaped by them in ways that aren't good. So I waited. Doug brought me news. He drove into town every couple of days, did his normal shopping, kept his eyes open. What he found was this. Brianna had begun, within 4 days of the yacht party, the process of contacting my bank. Not to withdraw money. She couldn't. Vance had seen to that. But to inquire, to ask what documentation would be necessary to access the accounts of a deceased or incapacitated account holder. The bank flagged it and called Vance. I sat with that information for a long time. She'd also called my accountant and a real estate agent in Tampa about one of the 2 properties I still own personally, and a storage facility that held, among other things, the personal effects I'd taken from my office when I cleaned it out before the sale. She was inventorying my life. I want to tell you that this was a surprise. I want to tell you that it came out of nowhere. But the truth is, I'd felt something shifting in Brianna over the previous year. something I'd chalked up to the stress of her marriage, or the general difficulty of being 31 and trying to build a life, or any number of explanations that required less of me than the real one being that her husband had been working on her for a long time and had watched it happen without understanding what I was seeing. On day 11, Vance called me on Doug's landline. He filed, Vance said. Dexter had retained an attorney and begun proceedings to have me declared legally dead. He'd provided an affidavit from a witness, a guest on the yacht, claiming they'd seen me go overboard and had not seen me resurface. "Who's the witness?" I said. Vance read me the name. It was one of my high school friends from Pensacola, a man I'd known since I was 15 and thought I'd known well for 48 years after that. I sat with that for a long time, too. I said, what would happen if I walked back in? Legally? Everything he's filed becomes immediately void. You are an alive adult. He has no claim to anything. Vance paused. The criminal matter is a separate question. What Fowler witnessed. What we can document. How solid is Fowler? Solid, Vance said. He's already spoken to the detective twice. He hasn't moved an inch. What about the champagne glass? Dexter had the presence of mind to take it below and wash it. But there's a toxicology report from the urgent care facility where Fowler took you that night. The doctor noted symptoms consistent with sedative ingestion. I thought about my daughter, about the expression on her face when she'd screamed with happiness on the phone. I said, I want to talk to Brianna before the police talk to her. Vance was quiet. That's not what I'd advise. I didn't ask what you'd advise. She was at our family home. My family home, the house I'd owned for 20 years, the one she'd grown up visiting every summer and every Christmas after the divorce. I don't know what she was doing there exactly. Measuring, maybe. Making lists. I knocked on the front door of my own house and waited. When she opened it, the color left her face in a way I've never seen happen to a human being in real time. She grabbed the doorframe. For a moment, I genuinely thought she might fall. I said, I'd like to come inside. She stepped back. I walked into my house. The living room looked different, and then I realized why. She'd moved some things around. Small things. A lamp. The arrangement of books on the shelf. As if she'd already been mentally redecorating. We sat in the kitchen. She didn't say anything for a long time. Her hands were on the table, and she was looking at them. Dad, she said finally. Yeah, I thought you were dead. I know you did, I said, and I know you had some time to think about what that meant. The silence between us was the longest I've ever sat through with another person. He told me you'd been drinking, she said. That you'd been unsteady on the deck all night. He said it was an accident. Did you believe him? She didn't answer that. Which was, I suppose, its own kind of answer. Brianna, I said, I need you to tell me what you knew and when you knew it. What came out over the next hour was not, I think, what she'd planned to say, or maybe she'd been waiting a long time to say something like it to someone who wasn't her husband. She told me that Dexter had been under severe financial pressure for 2 years, a real estate development in Scottsdale that had collapsed, debts she hadn't known the full scope of when they married, that he'd become different in the past year, controlling, that he monitored her phone, that she'd been planning to leave him and hadn't yet figured out how, that when I called to tell her about the sale, he'd been in the room. She'd seen something change in his face. I said, Did you know what he was planning to do on the yacht? She started crying. No, she said. No. But I knew something was wrong. The way he was acting. The questions he was asking. And I didn't. She stopped. I didn't ask. Because I didn't want to know. I thought about the calls she'd made to the bank, to my accountant, to the real estate agent. And after, I said, she looked at me. 48 hours of guilt concentrated into one look. He told me we had to move fast, she said. He told me it was just protecting the estate. That if we didn't move first, the government would freeze everything in probate for years. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I knew it wasn't right. I knew it, and I did it anyway. I looked at my daughter for a long time, 63 years old. 12 years of building something from nothing. Everything I'd survived. And this was the kitchen table I'd sat at the hardest. I'm going to tell you something, I said, and I need you to hear it plainly. What happened on that boat was not an accident. Fowler saw it. There's medical documentation that someone put something in my drink. The police have already been briefed. Dexter's going to be arrested. That is happening whether you and I resolve anything here or not. She nodded. Small, like someone receiving a sentence. What happens to you depends on what you do next, I said. Dexter was arrested on a Thursday morning at a coffee shop in Ybor City, where he'd apparently been meeting with the attorney handling the wrongful death proceedings. The detective told me later it was a fairly quiet arrest, which surprised him. He'd expected Dexter to run or argue. Instead, he put down his cup and said, almost to himself, that he'd known this was coming. I took that to mean he'd known Fowler saw him. I think he'd known from the moment the tender wasn't at the dock when he looked for it. He was charged with attempted murder, fraud, and several related offenses. His attorney from the Arizona development, the one who'd already been across the table from Dexter's lawyers in civil proceedings, provided documentation of the financial situation, which made the motive clear in a way that required very little interpretation. $38 million is a very legible motive. My friend from Pensacola, the one who'd signed the affidavit, retained his own attorney and recanted within 48 hours of Dexter's arrest. He said Dexter had told him it was a formality, a way to help the family access insurance. He said he hadn't understood what he was signing. I don't know how much of that is true. I know that a 48-year friendship ended that Thursday morning as cleanly as anything I've ever cut loose. Brianna cooperated fully with the investigators. Fully. She gave them everything. The calls she'd made, the emails from Dexter about the financial situation in Arizona, a series of text messages from the week before the yacht party that a prosecutor later described to me as not ambiguous. She waived her attorney-client privilege on a consultation she'd had, at Dexter's urging, with an estate attorney 2 months before the party. 2 months. They'd been planning this for at least 2 months. The question people always ask me is, what I did about Brianna. I'll tell you. She came to me about 3 weeks after the arrest. She didn't call ahead. She just showed up at Doug's place outside Ocala, which she'd found somehow, and sat in the truck for about 10 minutes before she knocked on the door. I'd seen her pull in, but I let her sit. I figured she needed the time. We walked by the pond out back. It was late November by then, cool enough that you could see your breath in the morning, but warm enough by afternoon to be comfortable. We walked for a while without talking, which is something we've always been able to do, Brianna and I, and I've always considered that a kind of grace between two people. She said finally, I don't expect forgiveness. I want you to know that. I'm not here asking for it. I said, what are you here for? To say I'm sorry, and to not say it on the phone. I looked at the pond. A couple of herons working the far edge. I'd been watching them every morning for 3 weeks. Brianna, I said, you didn't push me off that boat. I looked the other way. Yeah, I said, you did. We walked some more. The herons didn't move. I've been a lousy judge of character in my life, I said. I trusted a man who lied on an affidavit. I missed what was happening to my own daughter for 4 years. I'm not standing here as someone who got everything right. She didn't say anything. What I know, I said, is that you're 31 years old, and that you're going to be 63 someday, and I'd like to still know you by then. She stopped walking. She was crying again, and I let her, because that was the appropriate response to the moment. I'm going to have a hard time for a while, I said. With trust. I want to be honest with you about that. It's not going to be the way it was. I know, she said, but it doesn't have to be nothing, I said. That's not the only other option. Dexter's trial is scheduled for next spring. His attorney has floated a plea deal that the prosecutor has not yet accepted. I've been told I may need to testify. I'm prepared for that. I sold the Tampa property and kept the one in Clearwater. I bought a small boat. Nothing like the charter. Just a 22-foot center console I can take out alone when I want to, which is most mornings when the weather allows. Fowler works out of the same marina. We've had coffee a few times. He's a quiet man, the kind who says exactly as much as the situation requires, and not a word more. I've grown to appreciate that. Vance keeps telling me I should move the rest of my assets into a structure that's harder to challenge. I keep telling him I'll get to it. I'll get to it when I'm ready to think about the future as something more than a set of precautions. Brianna calls on Sundays. Sometimes I answer. Sometimes I don't. And she leaves a voicemail, and I listen to it while I'm making dinner. We're building something slowly out of what's left. I don't know what it becomes. I know what I want it to be. When my father was old, he made it to 81, the propane truck driver from Pensacola. I asked him once what he'd learned from his life that he wished he'd known sooner. He thought about it for a while, which was how he did most things. Then he said, "The people worth keeping are the ones who come back." I thought about that a lot in those 2 weeks at the cabin. I think about it now. I went back. Brianna came back. Even after everything, we came back to each other. I still don't know what to make of that, but I'm 63 years old, sitting on a boat in the Gulf of Mexico in the early morning, with my coffee and a view that would have seemed like a fantasy to the kid who grew up eating tuna casserole on Fridays. And I've decided that not knowing what to make of something isn't the same as not having anything. It's enough, for now, to have come back at all. I keep coming back to one image from that night. Not the hands on my back, not the cold water or the searchlight finding me in the dark. It's the champagne glass floating upside me, still bobbing, while the music played on up above. A $140 bottle of champagne, and nobody on that deck even noticed I was gone. What Dexter did was the end of a chain, not the beginning of one. He didn't become that man the night of the party. He'd been building toward it for years. Quietly, systematically, one careful question at a time. That's how it works with people like him. They don't announce themselves. They study the architecture of your trust and find the load-bearing walls, and then they wait for the right moment to take a sledgehammer to them. The consequences didn't happen to him because of bad luck or bad timing. They happened because the choices he made, one by one, added up to something that couldn't be walked back. What I've had to sit with is harder than that, though, because I saw the signs. Not clearly, not all at once, but I saw them. The specific questions about structure and wills and succession, the way his face changed when I called Brianna to tell her about the sale. I filed those things away under personality quirks, because the alternative, that my daughter had married someone genuinely dangerous, was a conclusion I wasn't willing to reach. I mistook comfort for wisdom. That cost me a night in the Gulf of Mexico and 2 weeks in a borrowed cabin and a friendship of 48 years that I'll never get back. The clearest thing I can tell you about what I've learned is this: paying attention is not optional. It's the thing, not just attention to balance sheets or market conditions or the logistics of a charter route, but attention to the people in your life, to what they're actually doing versus what they're saying, to the small moments that don't add up. Fowler paid attention. He noticed a guest asking about water depths instead of destination. He watched the glass get switched. That level of alertness isn't paranoia. It's the basic human responsibility of staying awake in your own life. I stayed awake in the water. I had to decide, treading in the dark 40 feet from my own boat, whether to climb back aboard and pretend nothing had happened, or to swim the other direction and use whatever time I had. I swam. 63 years old, dress shoes full of water, and I swam. I don't say that to impress anyone. I say it because I think there's something in it worth naming, that when everything you've built is on the line and your body is tired and the shore is far away, the only thing left is whether you're going to keep moving. The answer has to be yes. It has to always be yes. Brianna calls on Sundays now. We're building something slowly, and neither of us knows yet what it will look like when it's finished. What I do know is that she made a choice to come back, and I made a choice to let her. And choices like those matter just as much as the ones that nearly ended everything. The shape of your life is made from both kinds. The herons are still working the far edge of the pond most mornings. I watch them and drink my coffee and think about my father, who drove a propane truck and never had $38 million and still managed to teach me the one thing that turned out to matter most. The people worth keeping are the ones who come back. I came back. She came back. That's not nothing. Some mornings, out on the water alone with the Gulf flat and silver and the whole day still ahead, it feels like everything.